crucial to this whole argument that UFOs or orbs or some exotic military technology teleported this craft out of the sky mid-flight is the authenticity of this really wild footage. If the footage isn't authentic, then the whole thing falls apart, and the alternative community is always plagued with hoaxes and fakes. It almost never ends. So we have to spend some time early on going over the reasons why we should take this footage seriously. Make your case.
Well, the first thing I would say is, why is this footage reemerged is what people will ask. And how is it only now, 9 years later, even though we've been able to prove that this footage was originally from 2014, that people are taking it seriously? And the answer to that question is that our collective conscience has risen to a point where we can accept what we see in the videos to be real. We needed to see the DoD Navy 2017 leaks, which showed us what military infrared drone cameras would even look like. Without that, we had no basis to understand that the MQ-1C Gray Eagle thermalized color video is authentic. We also needed to see the 2019 Trump satellite leak. Before that, these satellite images are some of the most closely held guarded secrets of the U.S. military. We had no idea of what their capabilities might even be. But in 2019, when Trump leaked that picture, we had a very good idea of what a low Earth orbit imagery might look like. And it turns out the satellite we think was relaying this information was sent up in the same year as that satellite, which was USA 224. Now, in addition to that, we had to understand the science. And from 2020 and beyond, there's been a number of papers now that have shown that humanly traversable wormholes are consistent with theoretical physics. Not just that, but they don't necessarily require exotic matter in any way, and that they could create a shell around an object that could allow it to go through the wormhole without negative effects. The last two things that we needed are relatively recent. LK99, superconductivity. Humanity is on the verge of superconductivity, which will change and reshape the world. Prior to this, that it seemed like too far advanced that we might not ever see anything like superconductivity. And just as an example of what that might mean is that your phone may never heat up again. You may be able to have a phone that has a battery life significantly longer than what you have right now. We may be able to transmit power over long distances with no degradation or loss due to heat. And then the last thing is AI. So when we look at these videos, it looks too unusual to believe that it could be real. Many people, including myself, believed initially that this must be some non-human intelligence because it looks so exotic. But when you take into account the fact of AI, ChatGPT, that we now use on a daily basis, you start to understand that what we see here is a computer program that's being run, potentially by an advanced artificial intelligence that can very accurately create the pattern that we're seeing. So that is the basis to even understand these videos to be real. Then beyond that, from the debunk perspective, you need to be able to come up with a comprehensive story for how these videos could be hoaxed. And the linchpin there is that you have a very short window of time from looking at the archive footage that we have from Regicide and On account, specifically the satellite footage. The description on there says received March 12th, 2014. That's just 4 days after the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. So unless you believe that Regicide and On, which as you pointed out was just a UFO Twitter or UFO YouTube account, was somehow directly involved in the hoax, then there's really not enough time to even begin to create these videos. There is nothing that these videos would have come from either. They would be, completely original works. So I have a list that I think will pretty conclusively show that there's no chance that these could be faked. Now, the upload date on that video is May 19th, 2014, which is roughly 72 days after. So the first thing is that unless you believe that Regicide and On was involved, you have 4 days. And if you think that they were involved somehow, now you have 72 days. So you have between 4 and 72 days to create the first video. There's no reference copy. You would have to know how to create realistic volumetric clouds. The clouds that we see are extremely accurate. There's no discrepancies anywhere throughout these videos from a visual effects perspective, not in a single frame. You'd have to know how to accurately animate the cameras, how clouds form at the low altitudes, because we see these are cumulus clouds, which only form at very low altitudes. How to accurately reflect the light off of these volumetric clouds. The zap itself accurately illuminates the clouds in the foreground and in the background. You'd have to know exactly what MH370 looks like and the turn radius of a Boeing 777 in its certain altitude while it's in descent, which we've also proven that it is turning and it's in descent from the videos. You would have to know where the plane was at this exact time, which is in the Nicobar Islands, because we can see that there's coordinates in the bottom of the screen. You'd have to know how to accurately animate these coordinate shifts that we see in the satellite video. You would have to know what the weather was like in the Nicobar Islands, because we've shown from the weather satellite imagery between about 1 hour before or after this event that we can see these low altitude cumulus clouds. You would have to also accurately be able to create the smoke that we see trailing from the plane and the particles involved in that. In addition to that, the orbs, as they're going through the plane, you can see that they're distorted when they go through the smoke that's coming off of the back of the plane. You'd have to know what the thermal looks like to the level that would fool experts. And now I'm talking about the MQ-1C Gray Eagle drone here. This also means you have to have knowledge of military classified systems that were completely unknown to the public. As I just mentioned, we had no basis for what this would even look like until 2017, unless you were somebody who was already in the military. You would have to know to create a frame rate difference between the mouse and the satellite footage in the background, where there's a 24 frames per second versus 6 frames per second difference, which indicates that it was filmed on a Citrix session. So you would have had to build that into the hoax videos as well. You would have to know what type of mouse they use, which we believe is a plural view 3D type mouse, which is used to basically move the screen around, similar to how you would move Google Earth around. You would have to know what satellites the US has in operation and what their payloads are. You'd have to know what the false color IR looks like in the satellite imagery that we see. How to create the 3D stereoscopic imagery that we see from the satellite video. We've converted this video that we see is scrunched together side by side as two different cameras angled down. And it can be converted to a 3D video where you can wear the red and blue glasses and you can actually see it in 3D. You have to know how to animate those orbs in addition to what I mentioned from the flowing through the back of the plane and the particle system that we see that is in front of the orbs. It's pulling them forward, almost like a gravity engine. You would have to know what the MQ-1C Gray Eagle drone looks like, what its payload is, and how to get the camera angle exactly correct to be in the right position. You would also have to know not to use a 2D visual effect in a 3D environment, which is the debunk that most people think of, is that they don't realize that it's a low quality effect from the 90s. It's two-dimensional. In order to create the multiple different angles we see, someone would have to render a full 3D environment, which would then necessitate using a 3D visual effect or doing a high amount of effort to convert a 2D visual effect into a 3D visual effect. And then most importantly, you would have to know that we would never find the plane, not even 9 years later. Otherwise, the whole thing would fall apart.
Wow, yes. You're making a hell of a case. And you mentioned the mouse on the screen, which people should know is because this footage is somebody captured it from like a seat, like we're sitting in now, and took an imagery of the screen in front of them. So you don't know how big that screen really is or what the original footage contained. They were just focused on this one event because clearly this is probably the most interesting thing going on at the time. And when people watch the footage, it is like a dual screen. We see two side-by-side images. This is what you're talking about with the 3D stereoscopic aspect, because these two images are combined to make that 3D effect. And if someone was going to fake it, they wouldn't go to that extreme, I don't think. So that is pretty interesting. And so if we could, I'd like to jump to having you walk us through what happened and why it happened. And then we can backfill it with all the different details as to why you come to these conclusions, because the footage probably leaves a lot of people with more questions than answers. And I understand the community is a bit fractured over the possibilities. So I want to hear the narrative that you consider most likely now that we've made a pretty damn good case that the footage is authentic.
Yeah, and before I do that, I want to mention and just reply to what you just mentioned there, which is that there's a ton of intent that can be gleaned from the videos. And everything that I've written about has basically been deduced from just watching the videos. So the mouse you mentioned, you can see there's two different analogs at play. There's a black mouse that you see that does not change the coordinates. So what we're seeing here is we're looking at a Citrix session. We're not looking at someone who recorded it with a camera. They didn't use their phone when they recorded this. They were actually logged in and used a screen recording of their actual monitor. You can actually watch the mouse move off to the bottom left of the screen, out of the screen, and to the top right. Now that indicates that what we're looking at is a cropped version of a much bigger field of view, as you just pointed out. this actually shows intent as well. Is that in my mind, the person that leaked this was not a spy, because if they were, why are you trying to crop out information? They also crop out the drone as well. So it seems like they were giving us the minimum amount of information that would be required in order to solve the mystery, which to me indicates that the person that did this was somebody who was directly involved, somebody that had emotional reaction to what they saw. They were probably one of the operators themselves and realized immediately when they saw it that the world would never get the truth. And the only way that that would happen is if they were to leak enough evidence to be able to prove it, which they probably thought just from the first video due to that 3D stereoscopic effect. They knew amateur astronomers would be able to pinpoint USA 229 and the time that it happened and the coordinates that indicated the Nicobar Islands. Now, that being said, let's go into what really happened with this plane. So the plane takes off at roughly 1642 UTC from Kuala Lumpur, and it's going to Beijing, northeast. It has an uneventful flight for the first 45 minutes. At 1719 UTC is when the final communication happens, which is good night, Malaysian Airlines 370 from the pilot. There's no discernment in their voice. There's no alarms going off in the background. Everything sounds completely normal. 64 seconds later, the plane goes completely dark and it gets lost on radar. It's no longer tracked on flight radar tracking. And this is the point where we have presumed now that a fire has broken out.
Can you believe it, people? A video clip and a peek into how that sweet THC sausage is made. For some people, I'm sure it's nice to put a face to the name, so I started making clips that are a little more YouTube friendly than the full show tends to be. Get the full show on any podcasting platform. I prefer to keep it audio only, so we have a more decentralized distribution for a controversial show, and also so I can edit out the ums and ahs and barking dogs and all the things that happen when a person records in their home environment. And then if you really like the show, you can sign up for THC Plus, and instead of 1 hour interviews, you get the full 2 hour interview for just $8. I think that's a better deal, more of a win-win than asking you to support the show by booking a therapy session or buying generic Viagra. It's getting weird out there, folks. So just go to the highersidechats.com or click the link at the top of any set of show notes and all your wildest dreams will come true. All right? All right.
The Higherside Chat Show. Greg Carwood.